Welcome back, everybody. This is our lecture on our second High Renaissance master, Michelangelo. So again, the names of the three all-stars, the three most famous of the High Renaissance artists, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael, are on the screen there, along with the dates of their births and deaths. You remember, of course, that Leonardo was born first. Michelangelo is about 20 years younger than Leonardo. They did become very bitter rivals during their adult lives. Michelangelo outlives Leonardo by a number of decades, and Raphael, of course, is the youngest of the three, but tragically only lives into about his 30s. So we are looking to recognize some pieces. Some of them you already know, the David and the Creation of Adam panel from the Sistine Chapel ceiling, you probably already know. Moses from the Tomb of Pope Julius II, and the Last Judgment from the Sistine Chapel are the four I want you to be really familiar with. So again, we're looking a little bit at the start here about why these artists are considered to be so influential and so important. When you look at the subject of the Pietà, the pity or the mourning of the mother for the dead son, Mary mourning the dead Christ, when you look at an example from the Middle Ages, from Germany on the left, versus Michelangelo's adaptation of that same subject, you can really see a difference in the goals and even in the quality of the work overall. It's not that the art of the Middle Ages is necessarily bad. It's certainly effective at evoking emotion and expressing pain. But if we're looking at the goal of trying to make things seem absolutely believable, make them palpably real, then really the Renaissance is sort of the perfect blend of all the technique and perfectionism of the Greeks with the representational realism or verism of ancient Rome, combined with that narrative storytelling approach of the Middle Ages. It really is a rebirth of classical style, but with a Christian subject matter, ultimately. It's really hard, I think, to look at those two images together and not think that Michelangelo's piece really is superior. Just like with the Leonardo lecture previously, there is a ton of information here, far more than I can do in a summary lecture and more than you can absorb in one, I'm sure. So the lecture itself has about 158 slides. I'm not going to go through all of them. There are a ton of things there for you to peruse on your own if you have the interest to do that. Just wanted to give you a quick breakdown of Michelangelo's life and career. He primarily is working in and around Florence from his birth until 1495. He lives and works in Rome fairly briefly, then back and forth between Florence and Rome for the rest of his career. The Sistine Chapel ceiling project occupies about 4 years, 1508 to 1512, and then he is called back to work at the Sistine to do the Last Judgment panel in 1536. So over 20 years from the last work on the ceiling, he's called back again more than 20 years later to complete work on the Last Judgment. In red, you see right away popping out on there that the philosophy of humanism was central to Michelangelo's life and career. Michelangelo was definitely recognized very early on for his capricious talent, his incredibly adept skill at rendering in carved stone. That gained immediately the attention of the Medici family. He, in fact, was even moved into the Medici palace. So he was living in a situation of great wealth and privilege, certainly more wealth than his family had, and he was exposed to courtly life and to the life of the philosophers and writers and artists who were kind of at the forefront of culture in Florence during the High Renaissance. And so the philosophical school of thought that was prevalent at that time was humanism. Now, humanism for us is something that I think we can kind of recognize and relate to in a way. Humanism is all about perfecting or achieving the best of your potential. Humanist philosophy doesn't imply that people are without flaw or without sin, but it implies that we are perfectible, we are improvable, we are full of potential for greatness, but that it's inherently in our DNA, you could almost say. It is incumbent upon us to make the most of the gifts that we have and to live up to that potential. And that was certainly the world of the Medici family. One of the big advantages of living in the Medici household, of course, is that several members of the Medici family will eventually become popes, and those popes then are going to commission work from Michelangelo. We know that Michelangelo, early on in his career, working in the workshop of Ghirlandaio, and that's the artist you see at the lower left. And you see his fresco painting from the wall of the Sistine Chapel on the right. So it's kind of interesting to think that the artist who trained Michelangelo in terms of his painting skill, that Michelangelo will actually end up almost overshadowing him literally by virtue of painting the ceiling right above that painting that you see at the right. This is sort of a reproduction of a story about Michelangelo's career in the Medici household. You see Lorenzo il Magnifico, the leader of the Medici, and the great patron of Michelangelo there, looking curiously at this sculptural form that appears to be a faun or a satyr, the idea of a mythological creature from ancient Greece or ancient Rome. And there's a legend about Michelangelo actually carving works that were so similar, in the opinion of the art patrons of the time, so similar to the work of the Roman Empire that they believed them to be real. So we also have some fun with Lorenzo in a couple of ways. One of the things that he did was take a Michelangelo statue, bury it, and unearth it to try to pass it off as a piece of true antique sculpture from the classical world. And he really did fool people. And then, of course, it was revealed, oh, that's not really an ancient relic. This is the work of this up-and-coming young sculptor. So it's kind of a remarkable story. We also know that Michelangelo was really interested in learning from other people's work, and I emphasize that a lot with my own students. I think one of the reasons we study art history, one of the reasons we practice and try to imitate what other people are doing, is to learn how to do it. So what you're seeing here are drawings by Michelangelo based on paintings that he admired, that he grew up seeing in churches in Florence. It's kind of neat to think when you see the figures and then you see his drawings, you can see the drawings are even a little bit more sculptural than the paintings themselves. I think in some respects, the angle of the shoulders and the spine of this figure is greatly improved in Michelangelo's version than it is in its original source. Isn't that remarkable? That's pretty incredible. In 1490, he leaves the workshop of Ghirlandaio and moves to the Medici household. You see there a mask of Lorenzo and a sculptural form of his face to get a sense of what he looked like. We know that he did a number of pieces during this time that definitely showcased his interest in the classics, and some of those pieces are housed in a small-ish museum, the Casa Buonarroti in Florence. Michelangelo's last name is Buonarroti, so make sure you don't make that mistake. I do get this every now and then on discussion boards and essays. His name is not first name Michael, last name Angelo. His first name is Michelangelo. His last name is Buonarroti. This is one of the early works from the period during which he lived in the Medici household that's in the Casa Buonarroti Museum in Florence. This piece is also there. You can really see how much his work does resemble the best of the carvings from ancient Rome. If you've studied Art History Survey 1, then you can really see why he was considered such a genius. And he's doing these really, really early in his lifetime. This is a piece that I believe you briefly saw earlier. This is a wooden crucifix for the Santo Spirito church in Florence. So this is one of his first carvings in wood, and again, very early in his career. We think that this is the closest that we'll get to a lost Michelangelo piece from very early on, a piece that he designed and created that has since been lost, sculpture of the figure of Hercules. There are lots of other early carvings that kind of show what's to come, that kind of give an idea of what he's going to be capable of doing. These are some pieces that were created as part of a larger overall sculptural and architectural program, and that's going to become a hallmark of Michelangelo's work as he ages. His first Roman period begins 1496 through 1501, and it's during this period that he creates some of the work that he is absolutely the best known for. The big commission is really 1497's commission for the Pietà for St. Peter's. This is the piece, though, that kind of cemented his fame in Rome itself, the statue of the Bacchus that really truly looks like it could have come from ancient Rome. I also really like these early paintings of Michelangelo's that are unfinished, give us a sense of how painting was done in the Renaissance, but also the kinds of very clever approaches to color theory are being used. Things that we might think of as more abstract painting techniques are actually having an effect on what's going on here in the work of Michelangelo. Obviously, some of the figures are essentially finished on the right-hand side, and then there are that have barely been begun on this side. But you notice that underpainting, we talked a little bit about how oil paint can be thinned and applied in multiple thin transparent layers or glazes. You can see that by painting the figures first in a monochrome, a base level that is greenish, and then applying a pink or rosish kind of flesh tone color on top, is also creating more of a three-dimensional effect because those colors are essentially complementary. Green and red are opposite another on the color wheel, so putting a greenish tone underneath and a reddish tone on top is going to make that red feel a little bit like it's popping off of that green. It creates a somewhat more of a sculptural effect. This piece, completed in 1498, is perhaps the reason that Michelangelo is revered for having success at an early age. The Pietà is extraordinarily emotional, and it achieves some things on an emotional level that you might expect. We're supposed to feel her sorrow, we're supposed to feel the loss of the Christ figure, obviously, but it also gets away with some exaggerations that may not be obvious to you at first glance. One of the things that is really clear is that if you look at the proportions of Mary's body in comparison to the Christ's body, if they were capable, if they were physically able to be moved so that they could both be standing up side by side, she is proportionally much, much larger than he is. And of course that doesn't make sense. He's an adult man. He should probably be taller than his own mother. So why are they at two different scales? Is this a mistake? Honestly, I think the main reason for doing this is so that the figure of Mary, by being just that much larger in scale than the figure of Christ, it emphasizes her role as the mother and his role as the child. So there's kind of a psychological game that's being played with this piece that's really profound. When you look up close at the figure, you can really see the weight of the body pressing down. He really seems dead weight against her hand. The way her fingers are pressing into the flesh and the body is sagging there has always struck me as a real tribute to Michelangelo's sense of realism, his ability to create three-dimensional illusion. This is one of the only Michelangelo sculptures that actually is signed, and you can see his signature there carved across that band going across the chest of the Virgin. Close-up of her face. And that's a really important area for us to look at. Not, this sculpture was severely damaged in the 1970s. A visitor to the Vatican, to Rome, was a Hungarian man, Laszlo Toth, and he carried with him a hammer. He was disturbed. I'm not sure exactly what his diagnosis would have been in terms of his mental health, but he definitely was tried, so to speak, for his crime, but put in a mental institution rather than into a prison, because it was obvious that what was going on with him was a mental issue as opposed to a pre-planned criminal act. There was some thing about the sculpture, I think, that set him off, and I think that he believed in the moment that he was somehow acting on behalf of God or Christ in some bizarre way. He began to attack and smash the statue. And so you can see on the left the damage to her face and to the robes around her head. That has remarkably been repaired since. It's really almost impossible to tell at even a slight distance. You can barely tell how the piece was repaired. The most heartbreaking is the remains of her hand after the attack was over. This has since been repaired, and one of the most remarkable things about that story is that one piece of the finger was missing, and it was returned, believe it or not, was returned via airmail, and it came from the United States. So that implies that someone who was there the day of the attack pocketed the piece, took it home, then felt guilty about it, and returned it anonymously through the mail. This shows you the damage after the fact. You can see the break in her arm. You can see her face is really severely damaged as well. And there's one of the most remarkable aspects. There's the attacker, but there's also the average everyday people protecting the sculpture, trying to take him down, and not to kill him or to hurt him, but to stop him from destroying the sculpture. I think it's kind of remarkable to think that average everyday people interceded to protect this precious work of art. Kind of remarkable. I included this slide, again, not so that to memorize every single one of these dates, but just to show the kind of succession of the papacy during Michelangelo's lifetime. Michelangelo lived from 1475 to 1564, and during that time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 different people held the office of Pope during Michelangelo's lifetime. And remarkably, many of them commissioned work from Michelangelo, beginning with Pope Pius III. Perhaps the most famous to commission Michelangelo was Julius II, but he also received commissions from Leo X, from Clement VII, even Paul III. It is remarkable to think that these incredibly influential church leaders and political leaders would all recognize the genius of this one artist over such a broad span of time. I included for you some examples of the things that were commissioned by various popes. This is some of the work commissioned by Pius III. Obviously, the very famous works commissioned by Julius include the Tomb of Julius and the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Commissions from Leo X. commissions from Clement VII. These were commissions that were actually executed for the Medici Library and Medici Chapel. Commissions for Paul III included the Last Judgment and two of the last major frescoes of Michelangelo's career. And then under Paul IV, the completion of St. Peter's Dome. Now that was not completed at the time that Michelangelo died, but it had been begun at that point, and a few other major architectural commissions toward the end of his life. You can see that his career really spans painting, sculpture, but also architecture, and the major architectural accomplishments really tend to be toward the end of his career. The period in Florence following the successes in Rome, 1501 through 1508, are really kind of remarkable as well. What you have here are some of the unfinished sculptures. This was a commission begun in 1503, and I think when you see the finished pieces, you can see how Michelangelo's reputation for carving straight through from the front of the figure to the back, as if he knows where the figure is inside this unfinished hunk of rock, is really an incredible achievement in and of itself, but it also prefigures what we're going to see abstract sculpture in the 20th century. So Michelangelo is going to be a major influence for many, many years. Of course, this is something we've discussed already, his kind of competition with Leonardo for the Palazzo Vecchio, the two unfinished mural paintings. We know that the scene of preparation for battle was the theme that Michelangelo wanted to do, and of course the Battle of Anghiari is the piece that Leonardo attempted but was unable to finish. This is the best example of what we can assume his central panel of his composition would have looked like. It's a supremely masterful composition, incredibly intricate and difficult in terms of the foreshortening and the movement of the figures, but also showcases his absolute understanding of human anatomy for sure. We have seen multiple examples of David up until this point as a subject by other artists, notably Donatello and Verrocchio. We believe that Leonardo posed for Verrocchio's statue of David, but the one that we're really most familiar with is, of course, far, far different than this. Michelangelo's sculpture is massively larger than this. Michelangelo's sculpture from head to toe, not including what he's standing on, is over 16 feet in height. It was intended originally to be placed in front of the palace itself, and so he would have stood probably originally here. There is now a reproduction of him over to the side in front of the Palazzo Vecchio. The sculpture was originally begun on a 17-foot tall piece of marble that had been worked briefly by Duccio, and who then abandoned that piece. That hunk of rock was referred to as Monstro the Monster because it was considered flawed and enormous. It was too big to throw away, and people were afraid that it wouldn't be ever able to be turned into anything. And so, ironically, Michelangelo was able to take this kind of abandoned and theoretically flawed piece and create one of the most important masterworks of his career. There you go. The David is somehow the symbol of the Renaissance, and I think we should recognize him as not only the symbol of the Renaissance, but the symbol of the city of Florence itself. In comparison to Rome, it is smaller, but it is mighty and powerful in terms of the Medici's power, but especially the power of the art. So if you think of David as a small, young figure against a taller, more powerful enemy and still able to win the day, then you definitely have the David as the symbol of the city of Florence, no problem. The figure that Michelangelo carves, though, is obviously older, more muscular, obviously fully nude. There was an attempt to put a bronze skirt on him for a while, so that's kind of funny. That did happen for a brief time. Obviously, that was removed. But when you look at the sculpture, as you're seeing what he is representing for us in terms of the city of Florence, we also have to think about what other differences there are between the earlier examples. One thing that seems missing to me is the severed head of the giant. Where's Goliath's head? All the images of David we've seen up till now have been David after the fact. He's defeated Goliath and removed his head. And if you look closely, you can see that David, by Michelangelo, is holding the sling that he uses to throw the rock. And in fact, he's got the rock in the other hand. The sling is in the hand on the right of the screen. The rock is still clasped in this hand. So he's looking kind of to the future, to the very future, the battle he's about to undertake. He is thinking rather than acting. He's planning his strategy. He's thinking about the future. And he's thinking about that future in a very confident, almost aggressive kind of way. So originally the sculpture would have been displayed in the square in front of the Palazzo Vecchio and then placed, as it was originally planned, to be placed on the Duomo itself. It would have been essentially on the wall section, pretty much where the dome meets the wall. So he would have been seen from below. That also accounts for some of the distortions in perspective. His head is far too large, really, for the body. If you were to see him from the angle that it was intended to see him from about a story below, then the proportions would probably work almost perfectly to your eye. So you'd see him from some kind of angle like this from underneath. It sort of makes the head fit the body a little bit better. You can see the rock right there in his hand. Now, you'd probably never see it from this angle. Originally, it was intended to have his back facing toward the dome of the cathedral. So that is where he would have stood. This is another piece that was also damaged. It was, I think, in some respects, one of those pieces that is almost so precious to us that it is always at risk to have it in public. That's one of the reasons why it was moved from outdoors to the interior of a museum. This attack happened in 1991. Again, the attacker believed, I think, that something else was happening, something to do with his mental state as well. But the attack on the figure itself is really kind of regrettable, especially though because we know that there's the attacker, we know that there are stress fractures forming in the marble itself, possibly because of the numbers of people who walk past it every single year. It's kind of remarkable to think that the piece itself is so popular that just walking around it is starting to cause it to fall apart. The sculpture is one thing I think that Michelangelo would prefer for us to recognize him for doing, but he did make paintings throughout the majority of his career, and the paintings tend to have very bright color schemes. I just wanted you to see the scale and the decorative quality of this particular piece. This is the Dhoni Fondo, the Holy Family, in a circular format. There's the painting a little bit more up close. You can see that his edges are a little bit more crisp than the edges that Leonardo favors, and the colors are certainly brighter. You also notice that there's not a lot of reflection of color. The color of the blue in Mary's gown doesn't really affect the shadows in the pinkish color here. Everything kind of stays in its lane. The yellow robe stays, so the yellow color is just in that one area. The pink stays in the pink area. There's not a lot of reflected color happening. We'll see that in the work of the Impressionists more so than we will here with Michelangelo, for sure. Here's another unfinished Michelangelo that again kind of shows you his use of glazing and that greenish undertone with the pink rose flesh tone on top. Pretty remarkable work. We also know in 1506 that Michelangelo was present when the Laocoon group was unearthed. He refused to do the repairs to the elements that were broken and missing, and so one of his pupils did the repair work. The arm pieces that were missing were later discovered, but it was several hundred years later, and so this is their initial idea of what the pose was. That's what the actual arm pieces that were missing would look like. So that extended arm actually is incorrect. That's the correct position and how the Laocoon piece looks now. Again, you know this sculpture. I think you know this story fairly well. The main figure is the father. He is a prophet who knows the outcome of the Trojan War. And so in order to not sway the balance of power, the gods, of course, are intervening in the war as well. Poseidon sends his sea serpent to destroy the prophet and his sons. During the 1500s, the early 1500s, probably the most important commission, at least from Michelangelo's point of view, comes to him from Pope Julius II. Julius commissions, while he's still living, commissions Michelangelo to design an architectural freestanding tomb, also to be covered with an enormous number of full three-dimensional sculptural forms. And so he very eagerly begins this project, spends months selecting specific fine selections of marble from Carrara. The project lasts until 1545, but he's absolutely done with it. Ironically, though, the contract keeps getting rewritten, not only by Pope Julius himself, but by his heirs, and the design gets whittled away, gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So Michelangelo himself referred to this project occasionally as the failure of the tomb. But when you see it finished, you'll be surprised. What a failure is for him would be a masterpiece for anyone else. He gets interrupted in his work on the tomb to do, again, for Julius, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. This is a 4-year process, and he very much complained about doing it. He really wanted to work on the sculptural and architectural projects, but the Pope kept insisting that he needed to finish this first. It took him 4 years. The first half was unveiled in 1511. The final unveiling happened in 1512. The piece itself is almost 120 feet long. It's about 50 feet in width on a curve, and it's a relatively smooth surface that he has painted an enormous amount of illusionistic trompe-l'oeil architecture to divide the scenes. It's an incredible accomplishment. This piece, here you go, that's the whole thing sort of photographed so you can see the entirety of the ceiling. And there's a diagram here, and again, you can come back to this whenever you need to, that shows you the full plan or the full diagram of what every section represents and which characters are in which place. The main sections that we're most concerned with for the test are these center panels. It's the creation, dividing light from darkness, creating sun and the planets, dividing water from the earth. Creation of Adam is here. That's the one to know for the test. Creation of Eve, the temptation and expulsion from the garden. The last 3 panels are stories from the selections from the story of Noah, including the flood. They alternate on the outside with sibyls, female prophets, and male prophets. And so those alternate on either side. We also have the ancestors of Christ. We've got the family members of the Holy Family as well. There are some key stories told in the lunettes on the corners, including David and Goliath. One of the reasons that I wanted you to see the brightness of the color of other works, earlier paintings, is because this is how a lot of people in the mid 20th century thought the Sistine Chapel was intended to look. It had very much darkened over time, and there's a pretty logical reason for that. The painting itself, we know from Michelangelo's own records, he did not varnish it. And so after he completed it, of course, there was no electricity, so any light in that room other than daylight would have to be burning either oil or candle, right? So there would be smoke almost continually, and that would start to leave deposits on the ceiling. So in order to brighten the painting up as it darkened, they would apply varnish that would brighten it for a while, but would be sticky, and then more dirt would accumulate. There also were sections that were overpainted over various reasons. There were occasions during which people got squeamish about the nudity, and so sections were repainted. There was a massive restoration effort that happened in the later 20th century, and one of the things they did that's kind of remarkable is they took samples almost like you would take a core sample of a rock or of strata of the earth. We know because Michelangelo did not varnish the painting, you could tell where he stopped. He did this in true fresco technique, in which the tempera paint would bond and absorb into the plaster. So they were able to see exactly the point at which the plaster and paint ended, and the dirt and varnish and so forth was layered on top. And so in a really painstaking method, all of the work that was not original to Michelangelo was removed from the painting. Now, some people were really upset because suddenly the picture was super bright. But when you compare it to his paintings on panel, it really looks like the right color scheme. And you can really see the difference in the quality. Here's what people were used to the painting looking like. This is the same section. This is just digitally divided to show you what it looked like previously, and this section, of course, reveals the cleaned version. Really kind of amazing to think. The final stage of this restoration was finished in 1999, begun in the really early 80s. So it's a really huge amount of work involving lot of science, frankly, as well. And you get a sense for the scale, too, when you see some of the restorers working up against it. You can see how enormous these paintings are. You can also get a sense of how, when you're really close to it, the figure's still a little bit distorted. Remember that we're looking at a curve this way, and in this section, a curve this way as well. And so what's here would be much further away from you than what's there when you're standing on the ground. So the areas are further from the viewer, he's planned and distorted them to be larger physically so that they will look accurate when you see them at the right distance. So these are the main story panels, and you can see that the very first one, dividing light from darkness, is on a kind of small section. It looks almost like it's framed in marble. It has also these four human figures who seem to be standing or sitting in front of it and supporting these what appear to be cast bronze medallions. These are known as the ignudi, and this is all illusionistic, of course. That is not really part of the architecture, neither is this. All of that is illusionistic painting. And they're going to alternate small panel, large panel. Here's creating the sun and the planets, dividing land and water. Creation of Adam, of course, is the one to know. Obviously, you knew this one before the course began, and we talked a little bit about how Michelangelo is really creating this image with an intense knowledge of anatomy, obviously, but he's also changing the story slightly. If you know the biblical account of the creation of Adam, God puts life into the clay of Adam through his breath, and that's almost impossible to draw because air, breathing, is invisible, right? So that has been changed by Michelangelo. He had free reign about the subjects and about the way they were depicted. He creates this touch of the finger passing the spark of life from God to Adam. A lot has been written, too, about the way God is depicted in this image. The that jumped out to me as a student was that it felt almost like you were looking at a bisected brain. This shape to me read very much like the hemisphere of a brain. But it also looks a lot like the four chambers and ventricles and so forth of a heart. So there's definitely of anatomy and of God making us in his image is kind of an amazing work. There's creation of Eve, temptation and expulsion, and this is the one that you saw before that had that kind of slap across it. This obviously is the fully cleaned version. Noah's scenes, Noah and his family, the flood itself, and the final, the drunkenness of Noah, just so that you get a sense of what the prophet Sibyls look like. I wanted you to be able to see some of those, including the fact that we know that Michelangelo made his drawings for the female figures from male models. So quite obviously this drawing is of a male body, but quite obviously is the pose for the female figure in this painting. I wouldn't call this a true cartoon because it's obviously not at the scale of, and it doesn't have the other details in it, but remember, a cartoon is the drawing that is a plan for a painting at scale. Ancestors of Christ in these curved circular sections and the triangular sections as well. And the dramatic stories in the pendentives at the corner, slaying of Goliath. I've included, I think, majority of the Ignudi so that you can see their contorted poses, and you really get a sense of the connection between what he's doing for the Sistine Chapel ceiling as well as how it connects to the tomb that he's doing for Julius. I really think the figures in some respects are meant to represent human beings in extreme situations and showing us kind of reacting in often in kind of pain and in shock and in a way that demonstrates the struggle that people have to succeed in their lives. They often look a little bit like they're being sort of tortured or contorted. We know that he had some mixed feelings about doing this piece, and this is part of a poem that he wrote and with a funny cartoon. We know that he did the painting standing up as opposed to lying on his back. He had some assistance in helping build the scaffold system that he would work on. We know that he had some of his studio assistants apply the plaster and help transfer the drawing, but he did 100% of the painting himself. He didn't feel that any of his assistants were worthy of finishing the piece. But he also complained bitterly about doing it, and he did it in kind of funny ways. So this has been translated, but it does give you a sense of how much of the pain in the neck this literally, and how Michelangelo really did have a bit of a sense of, he's writing about the pain that he goes through in making this piece. Now, this was sent to a friend of his who was named Giovanni. So he says that he's hunched like a cat, that his stomach is squashed under his chin, that his beard points up to heaven, his brain is crushed, my breast twists like a harpy, the brush above me all the time dribbles paint so my face makes a fine floor for the drippings. It's just hilarious how he talks about having to poke his butt out to balance his weight, how his skin is hanging, how he's getting tense. It's all really kind of funny. He ends with some pretty fine stuff. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy. Anyone shoots badly with a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend it, Giovanni. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. There's another translation of this poem that ends with, defend my labors, good Giovanni, from all strictures. I live in hell to paint its pictures. Which is, I think, is a great way of describing how much pain he was in. We know that he left Rome at one point, and that the Pope had to send his guards back to kind of drag him back and force him to finish. We know that Michelangelo really preferred sculpture to his painting. We talked a little bit about the process of fresco, and here again is the application of the plaster. The drawing the cartoon at scale, which has holes poked through it along all the major lines, being pounced with this bag of dust to leave our little lines to follow. And of course, this is all being compressed. You wouldn't really do this much space at one time. You would only apply the amount of plaster you could finish in one day. One day's work is a giornata, and you can often see the line between the previous day's work and the next. You can see the line here well around that figure. Work that he did in Florence in the 1510s, 20s, and 30s includes work on figures that were intended for the Tomb of Julius and then that were not eventually attached to that project. He also did work for the Medici family, the Medici chapel attached to the Church of San Lorenzo, as well as a library attached there as well. This is the Medici Tomb, which features 2 members of the Medici family. It also is slightly truncated in its original form. It was intended to honor 4 members of the family. The Lorenzo there is not Lorenzo the Magnifico, but a slightly less famous. These are the steps of the library itself, one of the most spectacular architectural designs of the Renaissance, really kind of precursor to the organic shape that we'll see in the Baroque, the next unit. These are unfinished sculptures probably intended for the Tomb of Julius, and again, you can see that he's kind of liberating the figures from the marble in a way that really almost prefigures what abstract sculpture is going to look at, especially that figure to the right, I think. Then he works in Rome for the majority of the 30s through the 1560s. And during this time, he does complete work on the chapel, works on the Last Judgment. 20 plus years after finishing the ceiling, he's back in the Sistine Chapel. He also meets 2 pretty important people to him personally. In 1532, he meets Tommaso the Cavaliere, and then in 1536 or 1537, he meets Vittorio Colonna. There are a series of love poems, sonnets, written to each of them. We have no evidence whatsoever that Michelangelo ever really acted on any of his romantic feelings, but we know he expressed romantic love in his sonnets to both the male Tommaso the Cavaliere and the female Vittorio Colonna. So probably Michelangelo was bisexual. The work that we're seeing here is his perhaps most important later painting, the Last Judgment. And in this, you can kind of feel him coming to terms with his own career as an artist. He recognizes his own importance, I think, but he also has a pretty vengeful image of Christ returning the end of days to judge souls. It's really pretty remarkable. You see that Christ has a kind of aggressive arm gesture in this position. He's surrounded by saints and of course his own mother, and you can see souls being raised from the dead, being judged and carried upward to heaven, and then the souls of the damned are being cast down to a pretty terrifying vision of hell. So the whole painting kind of swirls in sort of a circular form, pivoting around the figure of Christ in judgment. One of the things that is really very remarkable, I think, is this figure here, paired quite closely with the Christ figure, is a figure known as Saint Bartholomew. And Bartholomew was martyred by being flayed alive, which means that he had his skin cut and pulled off of his body while he was still living. And so, as traditional in the Renaissance, very often a saint will be depicted with the thing that martyred them, or with a symbol or an object that relates to how they were put to death. So Bartholomew holds his own skin. But if you look at the face, he's bald with a gray beard, and the skin has dark hair without a beard, and in fact looks a lot more like images that other people made of Michelangelo. So the suspicion is that that face is a self-portrait. So perhaps he's having some religious conflict with his own personal life, with his own sexuality. The images of the figures you can really see do betray that tendency of Michelangelo's drawings to be more based on the male body with a few bumps to make them female. There again, you can see a little better the face of Bartholomew. The image of hell is really pretty terrifying. You can see the souls being kind of carried by demons, beaten as they are taken off of this raft and put into the fire. Raising of the dead, you can see here. It's a pretty scary painting, really. The demonic figures are definitely terrifying. So finally, 1545, he completes this commission, the Julius Tomb. We know the original contract, the original commission begins in 1505. The second contract reduces the scale of the piece very significantly. Third contract by 1516, fourth 1532. The fifth rewrite, the final contract, is written in 1542, and it really limits the number of figures that are going to be included in the piece overall. So the diagram I have there on the screen at the moment is the original plan, 1505. 1513, 1516, fewer figures, smaller, really fewer figures, 1532. There's the final piece. Instead of freestanding, it is mounted to the side of the existing interior architecture. It is remarkable and incredible, and Michelangelo considered this a failure because of what his original plan was. The main figure to know from this Julius tomb is the seated figure in the center that is the figure of Moses. Moses is depicted here holding the tats under his arm. You can see them right here, right? So he has just returned from his direct meeting with God, being handed the commandments quite literally, and he's brought them back. So he is carrying God's law to man. Now, in the contemporary translation of this story in the Bible, Moses' face shines with light after his meeting with God. And there have been a variety of mistranslations of that word. The original word in Aramaic does actually sound also somewhat similar to the word for horned. So if you look at Michelangelo's, and he is not the first, nor is he the last artist of the Renaissance to do this, but a lot of artists depict Moses after the meeting with God with these suggested horns. Michelangelo's actually look a bit like curls of hair that just happen to form. So it's subtle. There are other examples of Moses that have a much more prominent horn-like approach. But one of the things about the figure that I think is fantastic is he's seated and yet somehow still feels like he's in a standing contrapposto pose. There's an active leg and a slack leg, an active arm and a slack arm. There's a tilt in the shoulders, tilt in the hips, and you can see really the musculature of the body through the drapery in a pretty wonderful way. I've included some of the love poetry. This is one to Vittoria Colonna, one to Tommaso the Cavalieri. The last frescoes commissioned following the completion of the Julius tomb are the conversion of Saul and the crucifixion of Peter for the Cappella Paulina. We also have a couple of Pietà sculptures toward the end of his life. And of course, he then takes on the role of master architect, really huge impact on how the city of Rome looks to this day. This is the original plan of St. Peter's Cathedral. It is then sort of redesigned by Bramante in 1506, Michelangelo takes over in 1546 with a design that is kind of based on Bramante's original idea but completes that concept. Maderno then takes Michelangelo's design and adds additions to it to enlarge that space. So this is what Michelangelo's change eventually does. At the time of his death, the dome had not been completed. The drum was done, but not the absolute cap. So he never lived to see the piece absolutely finished. This is just a map to show you some of the locations of Michelangelo works in the city of Rome. Pretty much no matter where you go in that city, you're going to run into something that he did, whether it's a painting, a sculpture, or some form of architecture. I said Rome, I meant Florence. This is the River Arno, and here you've got the Ponte Vecchio, the old bridge. This is near the Uffizi Gallery. So some objects are in the Uffizi collection, but that's Palazzo Vecchio, where the sort of contest between the two greats that never really happened, never really finished. You've got the Medici additions on Lorenzo here. This is the museum that owns the Michelangelo's David. So the city of Florence is really important for us in terms of Michelangelo's career. But the city of Rome is equally important. Not only do we have the Sistine Chapel, we also have a vast array of architectural endeavor was involved in throughout the latter part of his career until almost the day that he died. And he, just like Leonardo, is going to be immortalized by Raphael as sort of a cameo in Raphael's own painting. 1511 was the completion date on School of Athens. As I said on the Leonardo lecture, I've given you an absolute treasure trove of additional information about Michelangelo and other pieces that you haven't seen. There's another 60 or so slides there for you to go through at your leisure when you have the time and interest.